history of Britain has often been shaped by war. Our ancestors fought to defend their land, their cultures and their beliefs, sometimes against invaders like the Normans and the Romans, constantly getting driven back here, and other times against their fellow countrymen.
Forget your chivalry. This is life or death.
And I'm curious to learn more about the key battles in British history to discover how they've influenced our past and our present.
From the massacre of a Celtic warrior queen and her army,
They're coming for you, and they're covered in steel.
to the Scottish king who defied the odds in a fight for independence.
A poorly armed band of men going up against the might of Christendom.
So I'll be meeting historians, archaeologists, weapons experts,
And enthusiasts who continue to live and breathe the stories.
to find out how 6 critical battles changed the path of this country. This is the town of Wymondham, about 10 miles southwest of Norwich in Norfolk. 470 odd years ago, a little local trouble here sparked a huge rebellion that resulted in the death of thousands. It's called Kett's Rebellion, and it's one of the most fascinating and violent struggles for justice this country has ever seen.
What started out as a minor disagreement about sheep between a farmer and the local townsfolk developed into an extraordinary uprising against the establishment. A class war in which hundreds lost their lives for what they believed was a just cause. The crisis began with a simple and traditional product: wool. By the 16th century, wool was hugely valuable. The more sheep a farmer owned, the more profits he could make. The problems arose in the 1540s when a change in the law allowed farmers to start enclosing tracts of open countryside to accommodate their increased flocks.
Hello. Hello.
To find out how the new enclosure laws were changing people's lives and livelihoods, I'm meeting historian Andrew Wood.
How did this concept of enclosure come about?
In the 16th century, a lot of land is held in common, so it's open wasteland where poorer people pasture their cattle, collect fuel. But increasingly over the course of the 16th century, what's happening is that the land is being closed effectively and passing into the hands of a class of wealthy gentlemen.
For centuries, the commoners of England had enjoyed free access to these open pastures. But now they were passing into private ownership, and the commoners were denied access.
Why were the gentry taking over this common land for themselves? I'm assuming a lot of them had huge swathes of land.
Well, partly it's got to do with the sheep economy. England in the late medieval period is experiencing a boom in the export of wool.
This boom of the wool industry, was that purely at the reserve of these wealthy landowners with their sheep, or did some of the smaller farmers have a bit of a look in on it?
Increasingly, poorer people are losing access to land as a result of enclosure, and so that their capacity to operate as small-scale independent farmers is going into decline, and they're becoming a landless wage labour force.
I mean, how big were some of the areas being fenced off, do we know, through enclosure?
Oh yeah, sometimes the areas of moorland could be quite extensive, so you're talking about pretty significant landscape change. In Norfolk, the enclosure movement is cutting up areas of common land that are more extensive going down towards the fenlands than they are within central Norfolk.
Some landowners were even forcing tenants off their farms to convert arable land into pasture for sheep. Once the commoners found their simple livelihoods under threat, they demanded change. It was called the Time of Commotions.
On the morning of Monday, the 8th of July, 1549, a group of peasant farmers set out from Wymondham with the express purpose of tearing down local landlords' enclosures. One landowner was Sir John Flowerdew at Heatherset, just up the road from here. He, however, convinced the men to leave his land alone and instead tear down the fences of another landowner in Windham called Robert Kett. Who was Robert Kett, Andy?
Well, Robert Kett was a wealthy yeoman, farmer and tanner. He's the second richest man in the town of Windham, and he's one of the most significant yeoman farmers in the local area.
What happened when the peasant farmers came to Robert Kett's land then to take down his enclosure fences?
Kett comes out to confront the rebels, and according to the chronicler Holinshed, who's writing a generation later, he says to them that he will now lead them in an attempt to subdue the power of great men, and at that point he becomes leader of a rebellion.
When the commoners attacked Robert Kett's land, they probably didn't expect him to agree with them and take their side. The law may have changed and Kett had the right to enclose land, but now he believed this was wrong, and that his neighbouring landowners were acting unfairly too. So he joined forces with the townsfolk against his fellow landowners.
Is there an element here then that Kett's initial involvement in this, what became a rebellion, was not necessarily purely out of sympathy for their cause, but maybe more as a diplomat to try and control the situation so it didn't get out of hand?
He's the sort of man in the town would be seen as powerful, significant. You would be expected to address him as Mr. Kett, to doff your cap if you were a poorer person, but it's not actually gentry.
Does Kett's involvement in the rebellion happen and build steam quite quickly?
Within a matter of days in Norwich, they've marched down the main road from Windham to Norwich. There's a bit of a kind of class war that's breaking out in the rural areas around the Windham area.
The following morning, Kett and the commoners headed to Norwich to present their case. On the way, at this old oak tree, which had long been a local meeting spot, they were joined by an estimated 1,000 more common farmers. Kett addressed the crowd, saying, "I refuse not to sacrifice my substance, yea, my very life itself. So highly do I esteem the cause in which we're engaged." He was prepared to die for their cause, an oath that would become remarkably prescient.
This oak tree became a symbol of the rebellion. It's now called Kett's Oak. On their march to Norwich, Kett's group was joined by many more commoners. At every opportunity, fences were torn down, ditches were filled in and hedges pulled up. The more I hear, the more it almost seems as if the rebellion was spiralling into random acts of aggression. To get a better understanding of that and who the rebels were, I'm meeting reenactor Ian Pycroft.
Aha.
Is it Ian?
Aha. Hello there, Rob.
I thought it
Pleased
might
to
be.
meet you.
How you doing?
And get off my land.
Ian, I'm meeting you today, and I'm seeing a peasant as one of
Ooh,
the.
I don't know about using the term peasant, my friend.
Someone in the commoners
Yes,
farmers
a
army.
commoner, a good working man from
Yeah.
1549.
Right.
We must get away from using this term peasant to describe us. I mean, peasant means country dweller in French. So yes, we are in many cases country dwellers, farm workers, but many of the men gathered here today on Mousehold Heath are tradesmen.
What they would have really had to fight with then is some of the stuff we've got. Haven't we? There's a whole arsenal you brought with you here, Ian.
We've got to take it back to 1265, when the king at the time, under the Statute of Winchester, said that every able-bodied man over the age of 16 should have armour and weapons in his house according to his income. And once we understand that there was no regular army and no regular police force, it makes a bit more sense that if there's a threat of invasion, where do you get trained or semi-trained men with armour and weapons from? You can call them from the shires, you can call them from the cities and towns.
So you're quite tooled up just in your everyday life, not necessarily going into battles.
Absolutely, this is normal. Everybody had this sort of equipment. Common to see a man walking around with a pouch and a knife with it. That was normal. It was normal for every man in this country to have armour and weapons according to his status, according to his income. That's been law for 300 years by now.
Common farmers like yourself here, you would have been equipped, but You would have been trained as well then, would you?
Every monarch successively through the Tudor period looked at these statutes and said, there's no point in us changing it. I don't think it changes until the reign of Elizabeth. So where we are at the moment in 1549, now it's absolutely still in force.
In the summer of 1549, the enclosure of open countryside by the gentry created misery for the commoners, who'd long used it for grazing. Outraged by the new law, a band of townspeople decided to march on Norwich, with the support of a wealthy farmer, Robert Kett.
On the 11th of July, the rebel army reached Norwich, then the second largest city in England. But when they asked to march through the city, their request was refused.
Historian Susie Childerhouse has studied the events of Robert Kett's protest.
Why was Kett and his army of rebels making their way to Norwich? What was it about the city of Norwich?
It was a very well established and rich place, especially from the 1300s onwards. If you come to Norwich and walk around, you'll see like a plethora of medieval churches and things like that. And they are testament to the money that was here in that time and power.
Well, what was driving all this money into Norwich?
It was the wool industry, would you believe it? Something as simple as wool was the thing that made the city great. The worsted wool from a little village up in Norfolk, the worsted sheep have lovely flat fibres, so you could make very fine cloth. And this cloth was then exported all the way across Europe in places like Florence, which shows the extent of how far the influence and the trading went.
When Kett and his gathering of rebels arrived at Norwich, they were denied entry. What was preventing them from getting into Norwich? Norwich is a city. Norwich, it's not like it's a building.
Now we would say that that seems like a strange thing, but at the time there were massive walls all the way around the city with a ditch dug in front of them, so they look even more imposing. So there's no way, you can't just walk into the city. You have to have permission, and if the gates are barred, then you can't get through.
What happened to Kett then when he was denied access into Norwich?
He came up to the gates at the south of the city, and then when he wasn't allowed in, then he started to walk around the edges of the wall. So he started to walk clockwise and then set up camp at Bowthorpe, where there was a considerable amount of people with him by that time. The ruling classes, the authorities, were then sending people in to try to get everyone to disperse and go home.
How did that play out then, these positions of authority coming out to meet Kett and trying to persuade them to leave?
The first person that came in, the Sheriff of Norwich, came in and was quite like, no, you must go home, and was more authoritative with them and demanding, but nobody listened to him. After that, Thomas Codd, the Mayor of Norwich, came up and was much more placatory and offering them things like beer and things like that, so that it would be a more acceptable offer to go back home.
What's quite interesting for me around this whole story, Susie, is the time frames we're talking about here, because it's quite a short time frame.
Oh yeah,
isn't
this
it?
is over like a matter of 3 days.
So on the 11th they arrived at Norwich and had been turned away.
Yeah.
And then that evening they're being approached by the mayor? Is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, and then the next day they started then going anti-clockwise back around Norwich to see if they could get in through a different approach, and then that was refused. So they actually started to walk around the entirety to get up here to Mousehold Heath. But on the way round they set up camp in Drayton Woods. And it's there again that they are approached by somebody else in authority, by a gentleman called Sir Roger Wodehouse, who, it seems quite unfortunate really. I think he felt like he would have had a connection to Robert Kett because he lived in Kimberley, which is next to Wymondham, and he would have known him personally. And he took with him things that would have been good to persuade a band of men who had been walking all day, like lots of beer and things like that. But they didn't listen to him. In fact, it appears that they treated him quite cruelly. So I've got a quotation here. He says that they seized him and stripped him of his apparel. They took his horses and all that he had from them. And then they cruelly cast him into a ditch, had not his servants courageously defended him from their insults. So he was saved. In his mind, he was saved by his servants. However, he could not free him from their hands, and they carried him with them and imprisoned him in Surrey House, and they had their first prisoner.
On the 12th of July 1549, the third day of Kett's uprising drew to a close, with the rebel force moving to Mousehold Heath, northeast of the city centre. The The strategic position gave Ket and his followers an opportunity to consider their tactics. How should they present their case to a city which had so far refused to hear them out?
By now, there were more people on Mousehold Heath than there were in the city of Norwich itself. It's estimated that 16,000 rebels were camped out up here, with food, supplies and weapons being sent in from surrounding parishes. At night, the people of Norwich must have looked up here and seen 1,000 rebel campfires burning on the hillside. To them, it must have felt like they were under siege. What would life have been like up here?
It was almost like a different society was starting to happen, as a place that was like a fairer society, an idealistic society was being set up by Ket and the people that were with him, because he appointed people to help him with this.
What does this establishment of social order within the community look like?
Centred around Ket himself, but also centred around the Oak of Reformation. And it becomes a place that you can have like provisions are meted out to people from there fairly. Laws can be organised from that place, and this is where the people that have been captured, like Roger Wodehouse, this is where they can be put on trial as well.
All these systems of authority that get established, does that tell us something about Ket as a man and how he operated?
This was not a bunch of anarchists who were just smashing and grabbing stuff. This was people who were showing society can work, it can be set up to be fair, and here it is. We're going to show you how to do it.
In practice?
In practice.
In full vision of the city of Norwich, this huge centre of administration and wealth and power.
Yeah.
Here's how you can do it properly.
Yeah, so imagine how frightening that would have been for the authorities.
This wasn't just about a city feeling threatened, but a whole society. In London, the ruling powers were appalled when they received a list of 29 grievances written by Robert Ket and his Council of Commoners. But who was in control of England in 1549? The robust King Henry VIII had been dead for 2 years, and his son Edward VI was just 11 years old and too young to govern. Power lay in the hands of a group of councillors led by Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector.
The King's Council send up a representative from London to meet Ket. The representative they send up is Bartholomew Butler, and upon meeting Ket and the protest up on Mousehold Heath, Bartholomew Butler actually says what they are demanding amounts to treason, and he then classes the protest as a rebellion, which is where we begin to see a shift in the way that the rebels are viewed. The message that was being sent up from the King and the King's Council was really that dissenters and rebels and those who didn't follow the law would be dealt with swiftly and dealt with harshly.
On the evening of the 21st of July, the mayor of Norwich demanded that Ket release the landed gentry he was holding as prisoners or face the consequences. For Ket, this amounted to a declaration of war.
First to strike were the defenders of Norwich, who bombarded the rebel position on Mousehold Heath with cannon fire from an artillery position at the Cow Tower.
Quite tall still.
Yeah, obviously providing a really good vantage overlooking the surrounding countryside. And you can see it was built for guns and cannons by the different loopholes around the outside of it.
There's not that much of Norwich's great defensive infrastructure left, but Cow Tower here still stands mightily impressive, I have to say.
Absolutely, it's one of the oldest standing artillery fortifications in the country.
When was this built?
So it was built back in sort of 1397, 1398 to repel potential French invasion. And obviously it stood ever since and has been used, obviously during Ket's rebellion, by the defenders of Norwich to obviously stop the incoming rebel invasion.
But originally built because of a threat from France?
Yeah, tactically positioned here on the bend of the river on the north side of Norwich, so that any invading ships have to slow down to obviously make that corner and come round the bend, which makes them a much easier target for the guns and for the bombard cannons that would have been housed inside Cow Tower.
Would Norwich's big defensive walls then have extended away from the tower?
So this area actually didn't have any defensive walls. They were using the natural defences of the river. So you need to imagine it's sort of a natural moat that they were using around Norwich.
How well armed was the tower? Do we know what kind of weaponry and how big weaponry they might have had?
You need to obviously imagine Cow Tower here bristling with handguns and with cannons.
Okay.
So obviously you can see there's loopholes up there for smaller gunpowder weaponry.
Yeah.
And you've obviously got larger openings for cannons to essentially aim out of the tower.
By first light, the Guardians of Norwich were laying down such accurate fire on the rebels that Kett feared his own artillery would be destroyed. He offered a white flag of truce to talk to the mayor, but the gesture was refused.
Under constant bombardment from the city's artillery, Kett had to think fast and come up with another strategy.
In July 1549, a change in the law allowed the landed gentry to fence off common land for their own financial gain. But it led to an uprising by commoners whose grazing lands were now out of bounds. One landowner, Robert Kett, took their side, and in a matter of days, the movement attracted 16,000 supporters from all over Norfolk. Their aim was to overturn the new law of enclosure and to defend social justice. But when they marched on Norwich, they were branded as traitors and fired on by the city's guns.
What Robert Kett and his army had in their favour were their numbers. And they advanced down the hill to the River Wensum here, firing volleys of arrows over the city walls. Thousands of them swam across the river here. They then set fire to the gates, scaled the walls and entered the city. To the alarm of the locals, Norwich was now in the hands of the rebels.
At Cow Tower, historian Lee Warden is showing me where the rebels faced off against the citizens of Norwich.
Where we're stood right now then, during the rebellion, during that conflict and the fighting, would have been extremely dodgy. What with Kett's rebels coming down the hill and the tower here defending, I mean, we'd have been right in the middle, no man's land, really.
Absolutely, yeah. This section of river is where the rebels attempted to cross to get into Norwich in order to basically get supplies and gain control of the city. Because with 12,000 people in the city and 16,000 people camped up there, supplies are going to start to run out pretty quickly without access to the supplies that contained within Norwich.
Given the sheer number of rebels making their way down to force their way into the city of Norwich, how much of a chance did Cow Tower actually stand in defending the city?
One of the downsides to the new innovations in sort of military technology, with gunpowder weapons being used much more prominently by defenders of cities and cannons being used, they're incredibly effective and loud, but they've also got a very slow rate of fire. Anything they hit, really, they're going to kill. They're going to be able to penetrate through armour. But when you've got thousands of rebels, you're able to effectively kill them one at a time, but it's just really slow going.
Do you think it was a strategic decision by Kett to invade from this side of the city? Because even though this is a formidable tower, it was still possibly a weakness, or at least a weakness in the defence that Kett felt they could exploit.
I mean, absolutely. Kett obviously really did have his work cut out for him in gaining control of the city. I think that's one of the reasons why Kett would have chosen this area of the city. Him being a local, obviously his rebels being made up of the local population, they know the defences. Obviously a lot of them would have been living in the local area. So they would have made this choice possibly because they knew that it would have been the easiest route into the city. By no means easy.
No.
It wasn't a walk in the park to get straight into Norwich. Cow Tower was a really formidable defence, but it was probably the best option they had.
12 days into the rebellion, the protesters were now viewed as traitors by the authorities. Upon hearing of the violent scenes in Norwich, King Edward VI and his advisors decided to send in the Royalist army. 1,500 soldiers led by Lord Sheffield advanced on the city, sending word for the rebels to surrender. But the commoners had already retreated up to Mousehold Heath. Kett calculated that it would be easier to lay siege to the city than to defend it.
At midnight on the 31st of July, the Royalist army were patrolling the city streets when an alarm rang out. Hundreds of rebels had entered the city and, using the cover of darkness and the maze of small streets and alleyways, launched hit-and-run attacks on the Royalists. This was guerrilla warfare.
The street fighting continued the following day. It culminated in the Battle of St. Martin's Plain, which took place in the area around the Bishop's Palace.
How prolific was the fighting in the streets with these guerrilla tactics the rebels were employing?
Essentially, the whole of Norwich would have been in uproar. The patrols that were sent out by Lord Sheffield, essentially to gain control of the city and obviously to keep an eye out for any potential rebels who had infiltrated into the city, were spread very thinly. Because again, Norwich is it's the second largest city in the country.
It feels like they've very much got control of the city now. What happens the next day? Does fighting start up once again?
The rebels started to realise that, they had to fight. This is something that they weren't going to be able to resolve peacefully. The king could have easily sent up an emissary or an ambassador just to sort of speak peacefully, but instead he chose to send troops.
And that fighting, that skirmish, becomes known as the Battle of St. Martin's Plain.
This local area is really where the king's forces begin to concentrate. They start to try and push the rebels out back towards their camp. And this is where the king's troops and the rebel soldiers have this battle. The rebels are trying to get the city back into their hands, and the king's troops are trying to make sure that the second largest city in England maintains, strongly under the king's control.
And how did that fighting play out here then? It is in this area.
The rebels outflank the king's troops. They manage to attack them from all sides, and even a well-trained army can't deal with being outnumbered, outflanked, just completely outmaneuvered, even from an untrained force such as a load of peasants. This is really the point in which blood is spilt.
The site of Kett's rebellion really is one of Britain's lost battlefields, now buried under Norwich. It's hard to visualise these peaceful streets as the setting for such violence and bloodshed.
In the heat of the battle, Lord Sheffield led a mounted charge and was pulled from his horse. As was customary in battlefield etiquette for a man of his standing, Sheffield removed his helmet and called out his name, a sign of surrender. He'd expected to be captured and held for a ransom. Instead, he was bludgeoned to death by a rebel with a club. With the death of their leader then, Lord Sheffield, is that it? The troops feel like, well, we've been defeated.
The king's army falls into retreat. They panic. The death of their commander, don't know what to do, and they retreat out of the city. Norwich falls into rebel hands, and the king's army retreat all the way back to Cambridge. They retreat for 68 miles until they eventually sort of stop and consolidate their losses.
At this point then, would Kett have been feeling quite positive, quite optimistic?
Yeah.
Almost successful. They've succeeded in taking over the city of Norwich and repelling the king's troops.
There will be a sense of sort of jubilation, a sense of victory. But obviously, Kett is an intelligent man, and he knows that the king has more troops to send. So the rebels are probably going to be steeling themselves ready for what's to come next.
The Battle of St. Martin's Plain cost Kett hundreds of men, but he'd beaten the king's army into submission. Reenactor Ian Pycroft is going to show me how lethal the rebels' weapons could be.
This is a bill. It's a very effective weapon, as you can imagine. It starts its life off as an agricultural tool, a sort of a normal billhook that you might have used for sort of chopping up kindling or doing hedging with, and suddenly you have a weapon
Yes.
which can be used
very
in a number of
effective.
different ways, to slash, hook or stab.
Were a lot of the weapons used by the rebel army then agricultural tools that had been repurposed and modified slightly like this?
Well, I suppose the flail is one. Flail was used for threshing of grain,
Let's
which
have a look
turned
at, let's have a look at
into
that. Because look at that now. I mean, gee whiz.
the great morning star. Where you want to hold it to get a good balance is just about there. And of course you can see what's going to happen. You're
Yeah.
going to rattle your own knuckles. But, as I say, it's a lot of force and a lot of momentum coming down.
The commoner's weapon of choice was the longbow. It had been the backbone of English defences for centuries.
So it wasn't uncommon for commoners within the rebel army not only to have a longbow but to be trained and quite experienced using it, was it?
They would have had these in their homes. It was still law to practice with the longbow on a Sunday.
You had to practice every Sunday?
Yep. If you, every able-bodied man in the country should still practice with one of these.
For the rebels then, who had, many of them had their own longbows and trained using them, do we know how used to they were in firing ensemble? Is it to send over a volley of fire, which is the kind of thing you need in a battle?
Maybe they had been trained at the butts on a Sunday to shoot on formation, to shoot on command. That would have been quite common, I think, that they would have all stood there at the butts and commands such as, but not limited to, knock, mark and loose.
Let it loose.
Knock is literally, as its name suggests, knock the arrow to the string. Mark is the equivalent of aim. And loose,
Doink.
flick your fingers and off it flies.
News reached London that Kett's rebels had killed Lord Sheffield and forced his army into retreat. The King's Council were determined to crush the rebellion for good. They sent the Earl of Warwick to Norfolk to restore order. Warwick was a highly regarded general, popular with King Henry VIII for his military victories across Europe.
The choice is made to send up a much larger army, more than 10 times as many men. The king sends up 14,000 soldiers, consisting of obviously English troops, German troops. It literally sends an incredibly powerful army to rival Kett's numbers, and to essentially meet them and destroy and disperse the rebel army at whatever cost.
The fact that the King's Council took such drastic action in gathering together this mass of professional soldiers, does that tell us something about how concerned they were about Kett's rebellion here in Norwich?
They understood the potential consequences if this rebellion was left unquashed. They could no longer just ignore it or pass it off as just a very localised rebellion. It had the potential to spread much further than Norwich and Norfolk.
What are the movements of the rebel army?
So the rebels moved back up onto Mousehold Heath, and with the arrival of the 14,000 strong reinforcement of King's troops, Robert Kett knows that he can't defend and man the walls of the city. Once the Earl of Warwick saw that the rebels were essentially relatively static on Mousehold Heath, where they had been throughout most of the rebellion, he essentially ordered the troops to surround the rebels, and a bit like a tightening noose, they were left with no other option than to fight in a pitched battle.
For the first time, the rebel army was surrounded and up against some of the most professional and disciplined soldiers in the land. It couldn't have escaped Robert Kett that his rebellion was under severe threat, and perhaps his days were numbered.
In the early hours of the 27th of August 1549, Robert Kett's rebel army of 16,000 men moved into position at Dussindale, a location believed to be on the outskirts of Norwich. What had started as a dispute over land for grazing sheep had, in just 6 weeks, exploded into class war for social justice and a fight to the death. Facing the rebels was a royalist army of 14,000 soldiers, which included a squad of German mercenaries called the Landsknecht.
Who were the troops sent up here?
Of the 14,000 troops that were sent up to deal with Kett's rebellion, there were also 1,000 German Landsknechts, so German mercenaries, who were trained to fight with pike, with handgun, and with Zweihander, so two-handed swords. So yeah, they were a very versatile troop that had come over from Germany to obviously deal with this rebellion.
How different is the way that these highly trained professional soldiers will fight versus the rebels' form of fighting?
Kett's rebels were obviously, they were an untrained peasant force. They were fighting using guerrilla tactics in a city that they knew very well, being made of the local population, whereas the soldiers coming up from London and coming from further afield like Germany were coming across with seasoned, blooded tactics that they would use to deadly effect on Kett's rebels.
For me, I think a key moment in this is the military experience that Warwick had.
For the Earl of Warwick, commanding the King's troops, he's a seasoned, a blooded soldier and a military commander. He's fought in Europe for most of his life, so coming in and fighting against an untrained peasant force that doesn't really know what they're doing, he can essentially call all the shots.
Kett's commoners outnumbered the Royal Army, but their significant lack of battle experience meant that things were looking bleak for the rebels.
Do we know how much they wanted to fight versus wanted to negotiate an agreement, a peaceful agreement?
They felt they'd been repressed, and grandfathers' rights and rights they'd had for centuries had been trampled and taken away from them. There's no doubt they were angry, but if they could have got away with a peaceful settlement, I think anybody in history would do that rather than actually want to see bloodshed. But once you push that number of men to a violent conclusion, that's what's going to happen, isn't it?
I think there is some evidence that Kett began to doubt possibly the final alarming sight of the enemy arrayed, looking much more forceful, much more professional.
As the two sides prepared for the Battle of Dussindale, the true strength of the Royal Army, with their skilled mercenaries and powerful cavalry, soon became apparent.
The knights that the rebels had to face were people of tremendous experience, campaigns in so many places, and their training was very thorough. They had tremendous experience that would have outweighed the experience of any of the rebels who were not, who before this campaign had no real reason to train thoroughly. They came to it cold.
The stark contrast between the organised, regimented forces of the King's troops and essentially the 16,000 strong mob that had come in support of Kett. They weren't divided up into regiments or troops. They didn't have specific training in how to use their weapons, and a lot of them obviously wouldn't have had any experience fighting in an actual pitched battle before.
Up until this point, the commoners' army had succeeded by using guerrilla tactics and the art of surprise. But this was to be a more traditionally pitched battle, which played into the hands of Warwick's royalist army.
As the battle got underway, thousands of rebel archers let loose their arrows. The Royal Army responded with cannon. Despite their confidence, Kett's men struggled to use their pikes with discipline, and they were constantly pushed back by Warwick's charging cavalry.
The rebel army's strengths were their fervour about the need to be victorious. And I believe they were determined right up to the time of the battle. I don't think they could afford not to be. They committed so much to this. They had not only that determination, but they had a good mix of very skilled people. What they did not have was the officer class who were really good at command.
The rebels were much more effective in that kind of guerrilla-type warfare rather than this huge battlefields, battalions and regiments going in.
Absolutely, especially when they came up against cavalry. They're not skilled horsemen for sure. And those who are also better trained, maybe with muskets, they're going to be slaughtered.
Unfortunately for Robert Kett's rebels, the guerrilla tactics they deployed so effectively in the city failed to work on the field of Dussindale.
How much chance did the rebels have at the Battle of Dussindale?
The only reason the Battle of Dussindale happened wasn't because Kett felt as though they could win, it's that they had no other option. It was you either get captured and executed or you fight, and you die fighting for what you believe in.
By around 4 o'clock on Tuesday the 27th of August, the battle was over. Most of the rebels fled, pursued by the royal soldiers.
How much do you think the lack of success in the end was down to the type of weaponry they had, and how much was down to their experience fighting as a group?
I think it's the latter. I think they had the tools of the trade, certainly in a street fight, because they did certainly fight through the streets for a while. Those sort of situations, but a pitched battle, no, they just didn't have the training or the discipline to do that.
The result was a crushing defeat for Kett and his followers. Almost a quarter of them were wiped out, while the Royal Army suffered minimal losses.
Rather predictably, Kett and his rebels take huge losses. It's probably about 3,000 soldiers that are lost at the Battle of Dussindale. That puts the rebel army into full retreat and then mass rout through the countryside. On the Earl of Warwick's side, the Royalist troops lose only about 250 troops.
What happened to the rebels who lived through the battle and retreated?
They flee throughout the countryside, but eventually they're rounded up by the king's forces, and they're offered a pardon under the agreement that they let all of their grievances go. None of their demands are met, and they're allowed to live with their lives.
Did all of the rebels accept the pardon that was on offer?
Some of them, they had fought so fiercely and believed so strongly in their moral justification for taking up arms and for protesting and rebelling against the laws, that they actually refused the pardon. And many of them were rounded up, were hung sort of across the city in the local countryside in warning to anyone else who was thinking of taking up arms against the king and against the rule of law.
Some of the rebels preferred to be martyrs to their cause for a better society than to live in the knowledge of their defeat.
On the 28th of August, 1549, here, just outside Magdalen Gate, somewhere between 30 and 300 rebels were hanged from an oak tree. But worse was in store for the rebel leaders. They were half-hanged from the Oak of Reformation up on Mousehold Heath, and then, while still alive, had their bowels torn out and burned before them. Finally, their heads were cut off and placed on the city towers.
As for Robert Kett himself, he was captured by workmen in the village of Swannington. 20 royalist soldiers rode out to arrest him and awarded the workers 20 shillings in blood money. Just 7 weeks earlier, Robert Kett was a well-to-do landowner. He'd sided with the commoners against the laws of the land. Now the establishment took him to the Tower of London, where he was put on trial for treason. It took almost 3 months to deliver a guilty verdict.
On the 7th of December, Robert Kett was publicly hanged as a traitor, and his body displayed in chains hung from the walls of Norwich Castle. It was left there to rot for 3 years, a warning to any who considered challenging royal authority again.
The story of Kett's rebellion really will still resonate even in the modern day, because it's a story where people are banding together to peacefully support what they believe is a very morally justified argument. It's a support where people are standing up for each other, for their shared rights against the centralisation of power and the centralisation of wealth, and the erosion of what they view as their own moral rights and human rights.
Robert Kett may be little known outside of East Anglia, but he deserves to be remembered as a man who gave his life for what he believed was right and became a symbol of the struggle for social justice.